No, we're good. I hope everyone could hear me. I know I had my microphone on, but we didn't actually start the broadcast, but we haven't changed any of our screens. So we understand that pharmacists need to educate themselves about CBD so they can educate their customers and community. We believe CBD belongs in a pharmacy, not a gas station. And we're guessing that you all feel the same way as well, because we had an overwhelming response to this webinar. Hundreds of pharmacists registered, and we had over 200 questions submitted already. So we initially had wanted to unmute everyone and really make this webinar interactive, but with so many attendees, the background noise would just cause too much interference. So instead, we'll try to answer as many of your initial questions as we can in the first half of this webinar. And we are asking that you send us your additional questions via the chat feature or the questions box, which should be located on the bottom right-hand panel of your screens. Tim's going to spend the second half of the webinar answering these questions live. Before I introduce Tim, let me start by reviewing some of the topics that we're going to cover today. So what is CBD? Is it snake oil? We're going to talk about the 2018 Farm Bill. We're going to discuss the FDA and the state laws. We're going to briefly review the ECS, why and how CBD works, and then we're going to talk about drug information. And as I stated before, we're going to then review any additional questions that any of you have. So please be sending those questions in as you can think of them, or you can wait until the end. But really, we were getting questions almost the whole time on the last session. We have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to introduce our CBD guru, Tim Gregorius. He is a registered pharmacist, and he's been with PRS for over 28 years. And as I mentioned, he is our resident CBD expert, having spent the last several years researching CBD for pharmacy as part of a new CBD initiative here at PRS. He is most notably and recently working on a CBD for pharmacy education and manufacturer recommendation program with a national independent pharmacy organization. So without further delay, I'm turning it over to Tim.
Well, thank you, Linda. And I do appreciate each and every one of you making time to be in on this webinar. We will try to be respectful of the fact that your time is valuable, and we're really making an attempt to just get right to the meat of everything you need to know. And hopefully there's not a lot of fluff or information that you don't necessarily find helpful here. What is CBD? It is a question that everyone's talking about everywhere. Why is it suddenly so popular? Is it medical marijuana? Is it snake oil? It's important that pharmacists have the answer to this question. And as we can, I can attest to the response that we had from the first presentation this morning. There's a lot of information that pharmacists thought they knew, and they're hearing some of this information, and they're coming back with a lot of questions about what they're learning and what we're learning about CBD. First, let me start off by saying CBD is a drug. That is a fact that we're not going to deny, and we shouldn't try to avoid that fact. Epidiolex is the first FDA-approved drug whose sole ingredient is cannabidiol, CBD. So it being a drug is something that several pharmacists earlier this morning were confused about. So that's why I'm stopping here a little bit on this slide. And it is a drug, so everything we know about it and things that we're going to talk about, sort of keep that in the back of your mind the whole time. This isn't just a flavoring or an artificial sweetener. The FDA and science looks at this as a drug. So CBD is one of the many active ingredients, otherwise known as phytocannabinoids, that exist in the cannabis sativa plant. Cannabis sativa is what we would call in the vernacular pot, marijuana. That is the plant's chemical name, but there have been two strains that have been genetically modified over the past 20 plus years, and those two strains have resulted in very different properties. marijuana is still marijuana, has a high THC content. That's a 0.3% THC content or above. That typically is the definition of marijuana. It is also obviously then very high in phytocannabinoids. It has all of the phytocannabinoids. So during this process of trying to make marijuana less intrusive into our society, research studies, people involved in levels of agriculture that is beyond my understanding, have genetically modified one of the cannabis sativa strains to be industrial hemp. And by definition, that has a THC content of below 0.3%. And in many cases, that's approaching zero. The industrial hemp is what we're going to be discussing for the most part in this presentation, because that is where CBD is derived from. And it should be where all CBD is derived from. However, we can't always guarantee that. So we do need to know that CBD is not psychoactive. It is not the part of the plant that gets you high. That's important to note. And there's also another point that there's been a lot of confusion on, and I still see it on the cover of magazines. CBD is not medical marijuana. And that's important for us to know. Medical marijuana is the cannabis sativa plant that has high levels of THC, and there can be prescriptions for it at dispensaries in certain states. That is not what we're discussing today. We're discussing CBD, which is derived from industrial hemp. So there are a lot of questions about dosing and drug information, mechanism of action, what's the ECS, what are CBD receptors, the first pass metabolism, side effects, bioavailability, pharmacogenetics of the chemical, etc. I'm going to get to that as far as I can, and I'll explain that later. But I think it's more important first that we have a little discussion about the 2018 Farm Bill, which sort of made all of this accelerate to the point that we are today. A lot of the questions that we received as you folks registered for this webinar revolved around the FDA's stance with CBD and the legalities and different states. I will get to that, but again, to sort of frame that and allow a context for this to make sense, we've got to first talk about the Farm Bill, which became law in December of 2018. So we're just looking at about 6 months. There are two main takeaways that I want you to be aware of about the Farm Bill. The first one is that the Farm Bill removed hemp that has less than 0.3, so it removed the cannabis sativa that has less than 0.3% THC from being on the controlled substance list. That's where this new and loosely defined product called industrial hemp, that's where this has risen from. So when, again, we're talking about CBD here, we're talking about the Farm Bill defined less than 0.3% THC industrial hemp, and that's where the CBD is derived from. Also important to note, though, that on the exact same day that President Trump signed the bill, the FDA very boldly announced that they still had full jurisdiction over cannabis and cannabis-derived products. They went on to say, regardless of whether they fall under the definition of hemp or marijuana. So the FDA made a strong point to say, this is a drug, we're still in charge of this, folks. The second takeaway that I want you to have about the Farm Bill is that it gave broad authority to the individual states to regulate and limit production and sale of hemp and hemp products. So as the federal government realized they needed to act here, they also realized we're going to leave this up to the states. They did, however, say states cannot limit the transportation of hemp through their jurisdictions. And we're gonna get back to that statement in just a moment. So the Farm Bill signed, people celebrate, business booms, the commercial market for CBD goes nuts, it explodes. Since December, as I'm sure all of you can attest, CBD in every dosage form has invaded coffee shops, restaurants, gas stations, salons, video stores, supermarkets, and of course, vape shops. It's basically everywhere. The FDA was closely watching all of this, and they're watching what's happening. All of a sudden, it's available in food and coffee and everywhere else. Consumer Reports data estimated that 1 in 4 Americans have tried CBD in the last 24 months. That's just an incredible explosion. So the FDA realized, wow, we need to stay ahead of this. We need to make a statement, but they weren't able to stay ahead of it. They didn't have enough information. They're really 6 months just wasn't enough time for them to get out in front of the problem. So as most of you, well, as some of you may or may not know, on May 31st, so just 2 weeks ago tomorrow, the FDA held the first public hearing on hemp products because the FDA realized they could no longer ignore these issues. CBD's mainstream, and like it or not, people are taking it, but the FDA said they're taking it with no idea of safety and efficacy. So the FDA, as always, is concerned about the public safety, and how that played out here is they realized they needed to make some statements, and those statements basically came around the marketing of the products. So I really, during this webinar, I'm really not wanting to read the slides to you. I don't want this to be a webinar where you're just listening to somebody read slides that you could read yourself. I'm going to make an exception on this slide and a couple of others, as I want you to really hear these words as you're reading them yourself. These are remarks by Dr. Nelson Sharpless, who's the acting commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. He said, "Our biggest concern is the marketing of products that put the health and safety of consumers at risk, such as those claiming to prevent, diagnose, mitigate, treat, or cure serious diseases such as cancer in the absence of requisite approvals. Selling unapproved drugs with unsubstantiated therapeutic claims is a violation of the law and puts patients at risk. Patients and other consumers may be influenced not to use approved therapies to treat serious and even fatal diseases. That being said, the agency does not have a policy of enforcement discretion with respect to any CBD products." So that's pretty clear that they're making a statement that this is about making therapeutic claims. So you having just read that and heard that, the FDA realizes they need to do something. I'm going to make an assumption that Dr. Sharpless is on this webinar, so I'm going to be very careful about what I say next. This is a prediction. I'm not lobbying for this. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but a lot of smart people I'm reading and talking to, and this just kind of makes sense, that the FDA is probably going to be in a position where they will create a threshold between a prescription medication, a prescription dose, and an OTC dose of CBD. Think of folic acid. You can buy folic acid in small doses over the counter. In the large doses, we still monitor that through a prescription. That's what I'm predicting is going to happen. If it doesn't happen, you're not going to be able to, we can go play this back. I didn't say it was absolutely going to happen. And when we start to look at the rulings by individual states, let alone each state's Board of Pharmacy, that's when a lot of these rulings get really sticky. So let's jump right into this. Recall that earlier I mentioned the Farm Bill stated that states cannot limit the transportation of hemp. Well, at least one state said, oh yeah, well, yes we can. That state is Idaho. They maintain that since hemp has THC, therefore it is a controlled substance. It's a C1 substance. They're not buying the fact right now that they could identify on a truck coming across their interstate system that it's industrial hemp versus marijuana. So this has really, sort of drawn the line. If some states are making that statement and the FDA hasn't stepped in and said anything, and the Department of Agriculture hasn't, so that's why we've got a lot of confusion, and we're fielding questions from 50 states. Is it legal in my state? Can I sell CBD? Can I only sell topical? It's because of rulings like this and what's going on specifically here. I've been in pharmacy for over 4 decades, and I haven't seen anything to compare to this national confusion. Basically, the internet provided a vehicle for tens of millions of people to begin using a product before the FDA and our profession could get in front of the problem. As a result, the FDA and state boards of pharmacy and the profession as a whole were playing catch up. There are individual states all over the board as far as CBD rules and regulations. And when I say that, those are state laws as well as state board of pharmacy rules and regulations, because oftentimes within a state, there's a discrepancy between the laws, let alone between what the FDA is saying. So as I said, I don't like to read slides for you, but I am going to read a couple of things here because I'm going to quickly detail legislation that is currently literally being rewritten as we speak in probably 6 or 7 states, with some up-to-the-minute updates, actually. In Texas, on April 24th of this year, the Texas House passed House Bill 1325, making it legal to sell CBD if it has less than 0.3% THC. The Senate passed that bill on May 15th, so now it's waiting for Governor Abbott to sign this bill, which will go into effect on 9/1/19, whether or not he signs it. So if he signs it, it goes into effect immediately. And that bill specifically mandates that anyone selling CBD must first register with the Texas Health Department. Not a state board ruling, but a Texas Health Department. So these are my notes I'm reading from. In the first session this morning, someone typed in, Governor Abbott actually signed the bill on Monday. So that's how quickly this is changing, folks. Literally, we're measuring the time that laws are changing in hours, not just days, weeks, or years. In Missouri, as of the June issue of the Missouri Pharmacist, the state agriculture department is requiring that if a business sells CBD of a percentage greater than 5% strength, they must be licensed. But currently, there are no licensed businesses to sell that product that are pharmacies. So again, the state board in Missouri has said that since CBD is a drug, a pharmacy selling it opens itself to quote unquote action by the board. Today, if I owned a pharmacy in Missouri, I wouldn't sell it. As a matter of fact, I have a good friend who does that, and we were on the phone the other day. She's leaving it sit in a box for right now. We're waiting further word from the State Board of Pharmacy. In West Virginia, last June 25th of 2018, the Board of Pharmacy in West Virginia put out word that CBD was prohibited in a pharmacy. On April 12th of this year, the state board withdrew that prohibition effective immediately. They also warned that in that intervening 10 months, they had done a lot of their own studies, and their own studies and findings showed that 1/3 of the samples they tested had THC in them. This is what makes it even more important that as you folks are making a decision to provide CBD to your customers and to carry it on your shelves, you got to trust the manufacturer, because you don't want to be selling something with THC in it. Just a couple more of these because I think it's important, folks. In Maine last fall, Maine stated that food or food products containing hemp-derived CBD was prohibited. On March 27th of this year, HPO 459 and LD 630, I guess those are House bills, stated, and I quote, an emergency act to clarify. Because they had to do that, they made a distinction between hemp and marijuana using that 0.3% threshold. So it's no longer prohibited. They weren't making a determination, a distinction between industrial hemp and marijuana, and they realized they needed to. So if it's derived from hemp, you can sell it now in the state of Maine. It does, however, go on to warn, rightly, that nobody should be selling this making any therapeutic claims. Louisiana, last November, Louisiana said that the Controlled Substance Act includes CBD in the definition of marijuana. And their wording was, quote, no one may possess or sell CBD oil in Louisiana, end quote. However, on June 1st, so again, we're just talking 13 days ago, the Senate legalized the growing of industrial hemp, distinguishing it from marijuana. But, and this is huge, the State Board of Pharmacy in Louisiana has been silent. So that would make me assume it's not okay to sell CBD in pharmacies in Louisiana today. again, can't stress enough the importance of you being in contact with your state board, as hopefully you're getting a sense from what I'm saying here. Some of these laws are changing in matter of days. California, let's end with California here. On May 16th of this year, AB 228 passed, and it stated that CBD from industrial hemp is, and I quote, not illegal in California. So California couldn't say it was legal, they had to say it's not illegal. And I'll leave it at that. But once again, the State Board of Pharmacy is silent on the issue. If we could go back to that list, Linda. So there's, you know, the top 6 states there. I just read you very specific legislation. We've got some information about Alabama, Maryland, North Carolina, and Florida, as well. Minnesota and Ohio fall into the same sort of category where there might be a state law that says CBD is not illegal, but the State Board of Pharmacy has either said we recommend not selling it, or as in the case of some of these states, Ohio being one of them, the State Board of Pharmacy has said do not have CBD on your shelves. An interesting note here, and John, what are the notes from the first one? Was that Connecticut that just passed the law?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So literally while we were live in the first presentation, we had somebody type in that Connecticut just okayed the sale of CBD last week. Not sure what that means, whether that's a sale of CBD in pharmacies or not. While I'm mentioning Connecticut, I do also want to give a shout out to UConn. They were a source of information for me over the past 6 months or more in gaining as much information as we could about CBD. They have a continuing education program on hemp and hemp-derived products. So sorry about getting down into the weeds there on a lot of this, but looking at these state examples where the Board of Pharmacy has ruled differently than the state has ruled, you can see how that creates this situation. We are now in a position where a customer is walking into your pharmacy, depending what state you're in, and asking you about CBD, and they buy it from you, or their friend or their neighbor, daughter, somebody told them they need to be trying CBD. One, you have to tell them you can't sell it to them, and two, you're really not in a position to give them much information. That's a horrible situation, because that customer can walk out of your store, go down the street to a gas station or a video store, a vape shop, and buy CBD. So if you're frustrated at that, and I clearly am frustrated, and most pharmacists are frustrated. I believe the FDA is frustrated over this situation as well. But right now, until things change with the ruling by the FDA and individual state boards, it's just a fact of where we are. And I think the FDA is really doing everything they can to make this happen quickly. They called that public hearing 2 weeks ago, and it seems like they're reacting to it. But let's face it, we're not used to being in this predicament. Customers are coming in and asking for our help, and they're asking us to sell them something, and we really can't give them any answers now. Where I believe we are is we have to start educating ourselves. That's the purpose of this presentation, and I applaud each and every one of you. We've had hundreds of people sign up for these couple of presentations, and that's a real positive in my mind, because you guys are taking that first step. Let's get ourselves educated so that when people walk into our stores, we're not there shrugging and really in a position to not have anything smart to say. On the registration, where most of you put in your questions, we had a great question from the owner at Spruce Mountain Pharmacy. He simply asked, is CBD the snake oil of the 21st century? And that's a question everybody asks. How can it cure all these different disease states, and how can it help for all these crazy things? Because it sounds like snake oil, doesn't it? If you read literature, you go on Google and you type in CBD for arthritis, or you could type it in for cancer, and there's some study or somebody making a claim that it works for everything. And how can that be? How can it help arthritis, depression, insomnia, epilepsy, MS, diabetes, the immune system, just go on and on? Well, the reason that is mystifying to us is because we don't really fully understand the endocannabinoid system. It wasn't even discovered until the 1990s. So as I have, and trust me, I was already out of pharmacy school by the 1990s, so I never heard endocannabinoid system when I was in school. And so there's been a lot of catch up on my part and a lot of other people's part. The reason that's happening is that we do not fully understand this endocannabinoid system. Let me give you a couple of facts here. There are 10 times more endocannabinoid system receptors called ECS receptors identified as CB1 and CB2. There are 10 times more CB1 and CB2 receptors in the human body than there are opioid receptors. So we're gonna leave this slide up here for a little bit. There's a lot of information on there, and I'm gonna sort of address a couple of things that I think would be a good takeaway for you having there. So if you look at the illustration of the body there, and you see the diffusion of the receptor sites for CB1 and CB2, maybe that can begin to provide some clues how CBD can play a role in treating all these ridiculously diverse disease states. You know, how's it going to be curing anxiety and MS and insomnia, as well as curing, not curing, but addressing the pain of arthritis or muscle and joint pain? Well, that is a clue for how that works. The diffusion of the CB1 and CB2, if there's action at those receptor sites, that can be acting on a lot of different body systems that no other single receptor system within the body has the capacity to reach out and make that happen. So this neuromodulatory system that hadn't even been identified 20 years ago is now proving to be involved in more reactions to maintain homeostasis than was ever suspected. Let me throw out a couple of interesting facts that I learned here during my research on the ECS. A particularly surprising feature of the CB2 receptors in particular is that they appear what scientists term highly inducible, meaning that CB2 receptors can increase up to 100-fold following tissue injury or during the inflammatory process. So let's let that sink in. If you've got a certain amount of receptors that are addressing homeostasis in different parts of the body or are mitigating inflammation in the joint, upon injury, now all of a sudden we have a mechanism that starts to make sense of why it would have an effect on a disease state as diverse as they could be. You pair that with the new discovery that the endogenous cannabinoids that engage these receptors naturally in our body before we're ever introducing CBD to the body. Our bodies, the human body, can synthesize and degrade the endocannabinoids on demand, because all of the precursors for these endocannabinoids exist in the lipids in the cell membranes. So again, I don't want to, at the risk of oversimplifying what's happening here, because this is an unbelievably and phenomenally complex system. You know, I've barely touched it, and there are lots of smart scientists doing years of work and coming up with an understanding here. And I'm really just trying to hit some high points, some salient points for us so we can begin to get an understanding. Let's think about applying external CBD to this system. So is CBD then able to go in and act like 1,000 endocannabinoid molecules would? There's all kinds of different science that's turning up different notions of how that actually happens. What we do know is that once this process begins, the body reacts and changes to it. So when we're adding CBD to the ECS, we're looking at a bell curve, a dose-dependent bell curve. We're not going to see any action at a low-dose CBD, but because we have this possibility of saturating the ECS, we could have the removal of therapeutic effect at a high dose, because it basically immobilizes, paralyzes, or shuts down the entire system of our body being able to create these and metabolize them. So you can start to imagine here the possibilities of why these claims that are sounding so unrealistic, and maybe it's not snake oil. Maybe this is just a miracle drug, and scientists stumbled upon this ECS that really is something that we hadn't seen coming. I could spend another hour talking about the ECS, and I would bore you doing that, and that's not the purpose of this. This is an educational presentation, and we want to try and cover as many topics that you folks told us that you have questions about. So drug information is a huge question that everybody has. The answers to these questions that you folks are asking, and we have about 75 other questions similar to this, I am very hesitant to speak about, especially in this public forum. Because how I would respond to a friend or a family member asking me some of these questions, how long does it take to affect? What do you think the dose is I should take, Tim? Am I getting the same bioavailability out of an oral dose as I am out of sublingual? How I might answer that is very different than I'm going to answer it publicly right now. Besides, as I said, we're not sure that Dr. Sharpless isn't on this call. So what I can share are some things that we do know, that science knows, that the FDA knows, that pharmacy knows about some of these questions. Basically, everything that science will claim and that the FDA and pharmacy will claim that we know about Epidiolex comes from, about cannabidiol, comes from Epidiolex. It is the drug that last June the FDA approved for two very rare pediatric epileptic conditions. What we know as a result of that must first be tempered by understanding that this drug, cannabidiol, CBD, when it was undergoing trials as they were creating this drug and putting this drug to the FDA for approval, there was not full human testing. And the doses were very high doses compared to what it seems to be these tens of millions of people a month that are purchasing CBD. That number, by the way, looks to be between 20 and 30 million people a month are purchasing some CBD product or another. Just anecdotally, I haven't heard anyone talking about taking doses that you see in Epidiolex, which is in the hundreds of milligrams per dose. And that's not what we're seeing at all. But again, a couple other facts. There's no evidence that CBD, I shouldn't say no evidence, there's no strong evidence right now that CBD is an addictive substance. Doesn't seem to be an issue thus far. We do know it undergoes first pass metabolism, so taking an oral administration is going to decrease bioavailability down to the 2 to 5, 6% range as numbers we've seen. Sublingual dosing results in about a 20 to 30% bioavailability of CBD. We also know that the topical preparations have negligible absorption. That refers back to a question someone had asked during the first presentation. Can you have a cumulative effect of CBD? Probably not, but maybe if somebody's taking an oral pill and they're taking it sublingually, but I really wouldn't worry, because I wouldn't worry about the topical preparation, because it looks like it's got a very limited, single percentage points of absorption. So that doesn't seem to be a problem. What we also know, speaking of the topicals, is that seems to be a very good entry point for pharmacists and other retailers and other people who aren't sure about selling CBD. You don't want to go ticking off the FDA or your state board of pharmacy, but it looks like selling the topical preparations, because they're not a food or food additive, they're not being taken as a drug, so they're really not on the FDA's radar, if you will. They're just having a problem with those therapeutic claims. That might be a good place for you to start and get yourself involved in CBD. Moving on to the side effects that we've known from Epidiolex. Again, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time here, but I also, as I led off with, I want you to come away from this understanding that CBD is a drug. So there are side effects. The two probably most written about. There are more studies on warfarin and valproic acid than any other. There definitely is a drug interaction between CBD and each of those drugs, to the point where a couple of studies have gone so far as to say that the warfarin dose may need to be adjusted upwards to the range of 30%. So that could be significant in someone on warfarin. We know that liver enzyme induction is an issue. Obviously, that can be problematic if somebody's already liver compromised or taking drugs where it's an issue, and they're going to start taking CBD. It's something that the pharmacist wants to know. For those of you that already have an understanding of pharmacogenomics and maybe have done some homework on getting up to speed on that, CBD we do know is metabolized by the CYP3A4 and CYP2C19 enzymes. So any drugs that induce those two enzymes, we know they're going to decrease CBD blood levels. So again, the drug information here is based on Epidiolex only, and as I had said, that was on these pediatric, very high doses, no long-range human tests. But I do want to, again, read a slide for you and quote what Dr. Gottlieb, who stepped down as the FDA commissioner in April before Dr. Sharpless took over. Dr. Gottlieb said in an interview, "It's a real safety issue here. There are risks of accumulated effects of CBD. It is not a completely benign compound." So I think we need to keep that in mind. Moving along to some of the other main categories of questions. Most of you had some sort of question about a brand. What brand's okay to sell? Is there a more reputable brand? Is there a pharmacy-specific brand? How do I know dosing, and so on? Well, PRS is currently in the midst of a national project to make CBD products available to independent pharmacies. We are vetting many products right now, and to be honest, it has sifted out that there are maybe 3, 4, or 5 companies that sort of fit the bill that we would be comfortable recommending they be presented in pharmacies. In other words, they're labeled correctly. They're pharmacist formulated, or the company makes sure that each of the products has a certificate of analysis with each product. For example, we would highly recommend that any product, and the product that PRS personally endorses right now, it has a QR code on every product, which allows you to scan the QR code on that bottle, and it's going to take you to the certificate of analysis and actually the whole lab assay that lays out for you the amount of product, whether there's any THC, any pesticides, the whole lab assay for that specific bottle, not just the isolate from which the CBD that's in that bottle came from. And that's pretty important. But beyond PR, the intent here is not to be pushing specific brands of CBD. We're going to have that in a further one of these. This is a series of webinars, educational webinars that we're putting together. So we'll address this question a little more in depth in a future one. What I do want to say is sort of one last thought here before we start taking questions. One of the questions that we get a lot, and it was something that just has been on our minds as well, is which brand should I carry in my store? And we realized that the answer to that question is, why would you want to carry just one brand? That would be like saying, which shampoo should I have on my shelves? Well, you have 20 different brands of shampoos, because some people think one brand makes their hair smoother or softer or fuller or smells better than another. And makeup, you don't just have one brand of makeup out on your shelves. We feel it's a similar situation here with CBD, and we're looking toward and maybe recommending that you have a CBD department in your store. And it looks like there's already some retailers where that's the case. There's an end cap with multi-brands of CBD, and that's a recommendation that we have at least right now. So that wraps up my presentation thus far, and frankly, after the webinar this morning, we got awful lively and we jumped around with a bunch of questions. It was really good, and I see you guys have already thrown in some questions here. I'm going to try to get to these and ask the very specific questions. Yeah, go ahead, Linda.
Okay, so this is more of a statement, but kind of a question too. It says, somebody wrote in, you're making it seem like no pharmacy can sell CBD, but isn't it true that most states allow pharmacies to sell CBD? Most states.
That's a great point. That's true. So I read the laws going on in 6 or 7, and 2 of those said that, hey, yeah, now we just created a law where you can sell it. So there's 50 states. I addressed 6 or 7. We had up there 4 or 5, 6 other ones. That leaves 35 states where it's not an issue. So if you would go back to that slide, and Linda's going to make this available, the entire presentation. Everybody here will have access to it. You can go back to that slide. If you're not one of those states that we had up on that slide, you're going to fall under the circumstance where the FDA has said, do not make any therapeutic claims. And if your state board is silent, that means your state board hasn't said, hey, don't sell this, or we're going to have a problem with you. So if you're falling into that, you want to be selling this, and you want to be in the game, and you don't want to be in that situation where we showed some of those slides where people are walking up to the pharmacist and they're turning them away and telling them to go down the street to the gas station. So yeah, great point.
Quick question.
We got a question? Reading this from the screen. I have a friend in California who told me that CBD can be sold at gas stations, but not in pharmacies. Is that a board pharmacy regulation? That's exactly what I was just referring to. We know that to be true in Florida. California is a little bit funny. Remember, I read there that they said it's not illegal, which is to me different than saying it's legal. But you know, we make the joke here that in California you can walk around and smoke a doob, but you can't sell CBD. So let me not address your California question so much as to say, yes, I agree with the spirit of what you're asking in your question there. In Florida, the State Board of Pharmacy in Florida has recommended that pharmacies not have CBD on their shelves. They haven't said, here's the fine if you do, and here's the reg that you're breaking. They're saying right now, until the FDA comes down with a more concise ruling, we recommend that you don't. Well, guess what? There were already probably 500 pharmacies in Florida that have been selling CBD before they came out with that recommendation. What are those pharmacies doing? I mean, I've spoken to some of these guys, and yeah, it's crazy. And that's that frustration point that we're talking about. So the State Board of Pharmacy has said don't in some cases, but people already are, but they haven't said we're going to come after you. So again, in our pharmacies, we're not afraid to be selling CBD as long as we are not making a therapeutic claim. If a customer comes in and asks for it, it's not illegal in the state of Pennsylvania to sell them a CBD product. It is against FDA law for me to say, oh, here, this will really help your arthritis pain, or oh, if you're not sleeping, you need to take this. That's crossing the line in a very blatant way. Beyond that, I don't have a lot of other guidance. I think that's just a big black and white way to look at that issue.
Okay, well, this was a question actually from the first session this morning that we all agree is a great question. So someone asked, does the pharmacist need to be an expert, or will people just accept that we are not?
Yeah, when I first got that question this morning, I didn't know how to answer it. I wasn't really sure what the person was asking. But do we need to be an expert? Yeah, I think we do. I think when somebody walks into our pharmacies, they're coming in to ask us a question that they know they can't get at the gas station, and they're going to come into us in our white smock, and you know, we're already filling the prescriptions that are keeping their family healthy. They expect us to be. Is that easy for us to get to the point of being an expert right now? I think it is, with everything that I've laid out about the state board and laws and the FDA and so on. But will people accept that we're not? I don't know. I think we'd be in a situation we don't want to be in there if we start turning people away and we don't look like the drug expert, right?
Right. What do we got there?
Another question. What's this one, John? Is it legal to sell CBD oil in North Carolina? I'm going to abstain because I don't know the answer to that. CBD in North Carolina, the Department of Agriculture in North Carolina has said that industrial hemp is now okay, but I don't believe the State Board of Pharmacy in North Carolina has made a ruling. So yeah, please, contact me, email me that question. We have it here. I'll try to find that answer. But I believe North Carolina State Board of Pharmacy is silent right now.
Here's a good one about dosage forms. So are all the dosage forms of CBD the same in terms of effectiveness, meaning tablets versus oil versus anything else?
Great question. And I had touched upon it earlier in talking about the bioavailability of an oral dose versus a sublingual dose versus the topical. So the question is, what are they all the same in terms of effectiveness? No, they're not. And I would also say that between brands, there's not going to be the same, just in terms of the bioavailability. What's it suspended in? A glycerin or some other type of a syrup and things that constitutes the oil that CBD is suspended in. So no, they're not the same. We know the bioavailability of an oral dose is incredibly small. We know that the bioavailability of sublingual doses is about a third of the dose that you're taking. And the topical, that obviously is working by an entirely different mechanism.
Is it legal to keep CBD behind the counter?
It's not illegal. Again, we got to refer back to, I'm trying to think the best way to answer this question. Is it legal to keep CBD behind the counter? It's not. There are some states that it's illegal to have CBD in a pharmacy. There are some states where, as I said, Ohio, the State Board of Pharmacy has said, do not have CBD oil on your shelves. So it's illegal. Now, whether it's behind the counter or out front, I mean, this is not an RX when it's being sold as this OTC product. Until the FDA makes a further ruling, I don't think it's legal or illegal to have it OTC or behind the counter. Reading a question here. In Texas, you said Abbott has now signed a bill making it legal to sell. Has the state board made a statement about it? I don't believe so. When I'm saying that Abbott signed it, that was someone from Texas in this morning's presentation. While I was talking about the Texas bill, they typed in that Abbott signed it Monday. So I'm reporting this information that Abbott signed it Monday. Honestly, I don't know what the state board I do know that in Texas, they've removed any legality around industrial hemp. So until the state board says no, it is being, there are pharmacies in Texas. There are pain clinics that I've spoken with in Texas that are selling CBD. I will say one thing, and I saw this initially on a Twitter feed, and I researched it a little bit. The county within which the DFW airport sits, the sheriff of that county, at least as recently as a few weeks ago, was acting almost like Idaho's Department of Transportation and saying, I really don't care what they're saying about it. I'm calling it marijuana until you prove to me it isn't. So there were some issues with people taking CBD oil through the Dallas-Fort Worth airport. If you're flying through DFW soon, I would just maybe look into that. I don't have any further information on it, but I would, if I were flying to DFW, I'd research that. Okay, so a lot of questions we got regarding dosing. It says, should we start low and titrate up? Linda, I'm sorry, I was reading the question that popped up over there.
A lot of the questions that we got about dosing. So this question says, should we start low and titrate up?
That's a great question. How much time do we have here? So I don't go. We're at 50 minutes. All right. I'm hoping I'm not boring you folks, and I'm going to go off script here a little bit. This whole thing's been off script. Actually, I'm going to answer that question in a way that I think I can get away with publicly without talking about dosage and titrating a dose. Hey, I don't want anybody to say, well, that pharmacist on that PRS webinar said. What I'm going to do is share with you my personal experience. My wife, we're both in our late 50s. My wife has pretty severe arthritis in her knees. A couple of years ago, she started having tenderness in her hands. That arthritis was spreading to her hands, and she was having difficulty. From an accident when we were in our 20s, she has a pinched nerve in her neck. So she's had some aches and pains. It'll be 2 years in July was the first time she tried CBD. We had a friend say this stuff's amazing, try this. So we did. I didn't know anything about dosing CBD at the time. We started off with what was about 20 milligrams per ml, putting a milliliter of it under her tongue. Tried that for 2, 3, 4 days, and she got no response at all. So like any good pharmacist would do, I titrated her up to 50. I didn't mess around going to 25 or 30, 40. I said, well, let's just go all the way up to 50 and see if that works. Literally within a couple of days, she had this phenomenal response to that dose. Took the edge off of the knee pain a little bit, but what it did was almost completely remove the inflammation in her hands. I used to be the standard relish and mustard jar opener in the house. No more. Literally, this has changed our lives. She has what I would say full function of her hands back. She's been on CBD daily for almost 2 years now. The pinched nerve in her neck is just so much less of an issue in our lives than it had been for the previous decades. It's a matter of the inflammation and the pain relief she's getting. Now, what we did over these past 2 years is she's no longer taking 50. We just did that for a little bit. So we started bringing it down. It took me a couple of months, took her a couple of months, saying, yeah, that worked. No, this is still good. Well, that 50 is upsetting my stomach when I'm taking a couple mLs of this. We found ourselves at a dose of about 30 milligrams per day sublingually for her, and this has maintained the relief she's getting. So I'm not saying that's the therapeutic dose. I'm saying that's what works for my wife. Epidiolex, it's up into the hundreds of milligrams per day to get that effect. It doesn't seem to be that someone looking for joint pain and those sorts of effects. It also looks like for other people that I've spoken with, and again, this is not scientifically based, and I'm not making an FDA claim here, that people are getting relief from anxiety, insomnia, and so on, with doses in that 25 to 40 milligram per day range. So that's my answer to the question. That is not the scientific answer. That is not PRS's official answer. I'm saying that my wife and I, our personal experience, we have found that. Another aside, her knees, had we taken it only for her knees, and we started this process, it only ever mitigated some percentage of the discomfort and the inflammation and pain. So if that were the only reason she were taking the CBD, she would have walked away from it saying, oh, that crap didn't work, because it really hasn't. And the reason for that gets back to some of those snake oil slides. It's not going to reverse tissue damage. You know, she's missing cartilage. She's got bone on bone. She has other inflammation processes there. That's not what CBD is going to do. It's not going to go in and regenerate bone and cartilage. So maybe that paints a little bit of a picture for you of bringing that snake oil sense back into focus.
This is related to dosing. Somebody's asking about GI upset.
Yeah, I think CBD itself doesn't really cause any GI upset. At least that's the way it looks. It looks like it's dose dependent on the oil that you have to take to get that higher dose. So if they can suspend higher amounts of CBD in equal amounts of CBD oil, in other words, you could have 30 milligrams of CBD in 1 ml of oil, or you could have 85 milligrams in that 1 ml. But if you're trying to get 85 milligrams out of the 30 per ml, you're going to be taking 3 ml of it's basically glycerin. So some of that GI upset might come from the glycerin. And again, we're back to this wasn't really well defined in the Epidiolex because it was done on pediatric patients at phenomenally high doses. So personally, I don't know how much oil the kids were ingesting during that. That's kind of my answer to that one.
Okay. And the other part of that question was about bioavailability. Should you be swallowing it or just holding it under your tongue, or?
Well, yeah, went into that one.
Okay.
The bioavailability orally is in the single percentage points.
Okay.
So yes, if a pharmacy in Missouri can't sell it, can I, in Illinois, legally sell it to Missouri patients and mail it to them? I don't have a clue. I'm not answering. Nice try. I'm not answering that one. That's interstate commerce. There's all kinds of things going on there. Call your state board. Call the state board of Missouri. I don't know how they'll respond. I would be hesitant to do that, but that's me. Do you have any experience with complaints of dry mouth? Is that dose-dependent side effect? Any suggestions to patients with that problem with CBD? My wife did have that problem early on, but I think she was taking a higher, she was taking a couple of milliliters at a time. So I don't have real good information on that, whether it's dose-dependent or not. I would say that if they're taking more than a couple of mLs at a time, it may just be the glycerin. The glycerin is gonna clog up the salivary glands and just be oily in your mouth. But that's a great question. Sorry, I don't have a better answer to that. One more question. Are we good on time?
We are.
All right, good. So we have another question here. Why aren't the chains selling CBD in states that allow it? Great question, because they're not stupid. Basically, they're going to be on the radar, right, in a big way, and they're going to have less control over any individual pharmacist or technician making a therapeutic claim. And how are they going to advertise that they're doing it without making the therapeutic claims? Basically, the chains would be no more or less against any law doing it than an independent pharmacist would be. But technically, the FDA has said, we haven't ruled on this yet. This is a drug. We're not coming after you. That Gottlieb, or not Gottlieb, but I read Sharpless's slide there. We're not coming after you with enforcement, but we reserve the right to do that. And I forget the exact wording that he said there. They can come after you if they want to. They're just choosing not to right now, again, because of what I said. We didn't get out in front of this problem, and this just boomed because of the internet. So that's the best I can answer there. Is the FDA tracking sales and using that information for visits to be made to pharmacies selling these products? Again, according to what Dr. Sharpless said on May 31st, that is not something they're doing. They have no plans for enforcement action. They are in an information gathering state right now. This public hearing that they had, they had hundreds of responses. They're asking CBD manufacturers, people, stakeholders in the industry. They're fact gathering. I think the FDA, I believe the FDA understands they really need to act quickly on this, because it's getting out of 20 million people, 30 million people are buying this product every single month. We need to figure out if it's safe, if it's okay.
Yeah. One more question? Yeah.
Can you provide a link to the Yukon CME program? We sure can.
We will. We'll send that out.
We'll do that. And I've not contacted Yukon or anything, and this is no official endorsement. I was just sharing, a personal thing there that happened. But yeah, we'll include that for sure.
I think we're at the end here. So there was one more question. Is there a max dose of CBD?
Don't know. We know that the pediatrics, the kids are taking, they can take upwards of a couple of hundred. I had mentioned before, when I briefly mentioned the bell curve, that it does seem that you get this quote unquote short circuiting of the ECS when the dose is too high. In other words, it doesn't allow the system to quote unquote breathe, because you've got to be synthesizing and degrading these endocannabinoids you know, to the tune of, you know, billions of times a day, in the presence of too high a dose of CBD, it seems like there is a negative reaction against that system. But that's for smarter people to answer than me.
Okay, we're at the time. We're a minute over. So.
Oops.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Sorry about that. My information's been up there. Do not hesitate to call me. I already fielded a bunch of phone calls after the first presentation. You can email me any questions, and we will make this available to everybody.
We'll email it out. Yeah, we're going to email a link, and it'll also be available on our marketplace, prsmarketplace.com. If you just click on the webinar link, you'll be able to listen to exactly what you heard today. Great.
John Watkins has been here helping. What, John?
I just will respond to other questions.
Oh, yeah. We're
Yes.
going to try and get to some of these questions that we didn't have a chance to respond to.
Yep. If you send us a question, we absolutely will get you an answer back.
Thank you. This last half hour would have been rough if you guys hadn't been putting in the questions. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for the input and the participation. Thank you. Bye-bye.